Why is South Africa still so segregated? People were segregated by race for many years in South Africa under apartheid. Later, during the 1990s, these laws were repealed. However, a large number of the obstacles they built still divide South Africans based on their skin tone, affecting their standard of living, access to jobs, and wealth. South Africa's cities were constructed with racial division in mind, and it hasn't been eradicated yet. This is in part because racial divisions in South Africa didn't start with apartheid. Rather, it marked their apex. When the British constructed a network of railroads in the early 1800s, they changed the region's economy so that the majority of black people were excluded from it. They then made this exclusion against the law. Continue watching this video to learn how South Africans in all parts of the country are still affected by this long history. Please click the notification bell and subscribe buttons so you won't miss out on more fantastic content like this. Without further ado, let's begin. As whites dealt with the native question, segregation emerged as a distinctive aspect of South African political, social, and economic life during the first 2 decades of the Union. Blacks were retribalized, and their racial distinctions were emphasized. Racial segregation was made possible by new laws in the industrial, territorial, administrative, and residential spheres. This flurry of legislation was a result of both reactionary attitudes carried over from the past and an effort to control class and racial relations during a time of rapid industrialization and a steadily increasing black population. White workers were only allowed to work in certain mining and railroad jobs under the 1911 Mines and Works Act and its 1926 successor. Less than 10% of South Africa was designated as reserves for black people by the Natives Land Act of 1913, which also outlawed blacks from leasing or purchasing land outside of these designated areas. The law also limited the length of time that blacks could reside on farms that were owned by white people. In order to restrict blacks' access to cities, the Native Urban Areas Act of 1923 segregated urban residential space and instituted influx controls. In 1926, Hertzog proposed expanding the reserve areas and removing black voters from the common roll in the Cape. These proposals were eventually carried out thanks to the Representation of Natives Act 1936. In order to elect 3 white representatives to the House of Assembly, black voters cast ballots separately. The pact years 1924 to 1933. The Herzog's pact administration boosted South Africa's independence, supported local businesses, and shielded white employees from black competition. Herzog also took the lead at the Imperial Conference in London, which resulted in the Balfour Report, 1926, which gave the Dominions autonomy in foreign affairs. Herzog focused his efforts on developing the national anthem and flag after his return from Britain. Economic nationalism included state-run iron and steel production, subsidies for agricultural exports, and protective tariffs for local industry. White trade unions became less militant and more bureaucratic, though their members attained at most modest material advancements. Whites who were unskilled and unorganized benefited more directly from sheltered employment in the public sector and set minimum wages in the private sector. The manufacturing sector hired white labor nearly twice as quickly as black labor thanks to these policies, despite the fact that the overall level of white poverty remained high. Blacks made only modest gains during this time and kept losing earlier advantages. For them, segregation meant less freedom of movement, fewer opportunities, stricter regulations, and a general feeling of exclusion. The slums offered a harsh alternative for those who left the land. The economic conditions in the reserves continued to deteriorate, and the tenancy conditions on white-owned farms became more onerous. In response to the worsening circumstances, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, ICU, the first mass-based black political organization, prospered. Up until 1926, the ICU was based in Cape Town, with the majority of its black and some colored members coming from cities. Many thousands of black tenants on white farms supported it as a widely supported form of rural protest. The ICU connected numerous small-town rural complaints with a broad call for land and freedom. but by 1929 its influence had diminished. However, it served as a foundation for other businesses. The Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, established in 1921, was initially almost exclusively active within white trade unions. However, starting in 1925, it began to actively recruit black members, and from 1928 to 1929, it made calls for black majority rule and closer ties with the ANC. Its connection to the ANC was most notable during the presidency of José Gumede, 1927-30, whose political views shifted to the left in the late 1920s. As a result, the more moderate members expelled the more radical ones, which caused a split in the ANC in 1930. The political opposition to white supremacy was reflected in the 1929 general elections. White electoral politics were dominated by native policy issues for the first time since the Union. Black peril and communist menace became the rallying cries of Afrikaner nationalists. It wouldn't be the only time like this. The intensification of apartheid in the 1930s. The British Parliament's passage of the Statute of Westminster, which eliminated the final traces of British legal control over South Africa, marked a significant victory for the Hertzog government in 1931. 3 years later, the Status of the Union Act, which proclaimed South Africa to be a sovereign independent state, was passed by the South African Parliament, solidifying that judgment. Hertzog formed a coalition with his rival Smuts in 1933 despite the fact that his National Party held a majority of seats in the House of Assembly and controlled the South African cabinet in the early 1930s due to its poor handling of problems brought on by the Great Depression. Smuts served as the leader of the South African Party, which was supported by powerful industrialists and comprised the majority of English-speaking white people, who made up less than half of the white population. When the two groups merged in 1934, Hertzog became the party's leader and Smuts served as his deputy. The two political parties and the two leaders shared a desire to favor the electorate that was mostly white over the electorate that was entirely black. They also agreed to stop blacks from moving from the reservations into the towns and to support white farmers heavily while also helping poor whites by giving them jobs free from black competition. Daniel F. Mallon, a member of the National Party, opposed the merging of the parties and opted to maintain the National Party's existence. Following the end of the gold standard by Britain and the United States in the early 1930s, South Africa's gold export revenues increased significantly. New secondary industries were created, white farmers prospered, and South Africans of all races continued to move to the towns. South Africa transformed from a largely rural nation that imported manufactured consumer goods and exported raw materials into a nation with a diverse economy. The lives of coloreds, blacks, and Indians were hardly impacted by this expansion, despite the fact that the majority of white people's standard of living significantly improved. In 1936, the government did add some land to the reserves, but it was never more than 13% of the total area of the nation. Nearly 90% of South Africa, including the majority of the mineral deposits and the best agricultural land, belonged to white people only until the end of apartheid. Unsurprisingly, due to overpopulation and soil erosion, the conditions on the native reserves progressively deteriorated. By enforcing the construction of contour ridges to prevent soil erosion and maintaining strict control over land use in the reserves, the government attempted to address these issues through a number of initiatives known as betterment schemes. A large percentage of the men were forced to work for pay outside of the reserves because of overcrowding on white farms or in the towns where they had to contend with a hostile environment. Black and colored farm workers were isolated and dispersed in small groups throughout the agricultural areas. In the towns, life was unstable and wages were low. Between 1911 and 1941, black miners' real wages in the gold mining industry fell by about 1/7, while white miners were paid 12 times as much. Hendrik F. Verwoerd was a key player in making apartheid a reality rather than just an election slogan. Verwoerd, who was born in the Netherlands, moved to South Africa with his parents when he was a young boy. He was appointed Minister of Native Affairs in 1950, and from 1958 until his assassination in Parliament in 1966 by a man of color named Dimitri Sefendis, he served as Prime Minister. After the murder, Sefendis was deemed insane and committed to a mental hospital. B.J. Vorster, Verwoerd's successor, had served as Minister of Justice, Police, and Prisons and shared his white supremacist views. In Verwoerd's idealized version of South Africa, there were 4 distinct racial groups: white, black, colored, and Asian, each with its own distinct culture. Whites had the right to rule the state because they were the more civilized race. Numerous laws were passed by the all-white parliament to legitimize and maintain the apartheid regime. Each South African was given a race classification under the Population Registration Act of 1950. Interracial relationships were forbidden by the Immorality Act of 1950 and the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949, respectively. The Suppression of Communism Act of 1950 gave the government the authority to detain anyone it believed might further communist goals, and broadly defined communism and its objectives to include any form of political opposition. The Indemnity Act of 1961 made it acceptable for police officers to use violence, torture, or even murder while performing their official duties. Later laws gave police the authority to detain suspects without charge or trial and bar them from seeing their loved ones or attorneys. South Africans were separated by additional laws and policies, collectively known as petty apartheid, in every aspect of life, including access to beaches, trains, waiting rooms, cinemas, restaurants, and hearses. In order to overturn a court's ruling that different amenities should be equal, Parliament passed a special law. The physical segregation of racial groups in the cities and the countryside was referred to as Grand Apartheid, in contrast. The Group Areas Act, 1950, segregated the residential and commercial areas of South African cities and towns. The areas designated for white occupation were cleared of thousands of coloreds, blacks, and Indians. South Africa is reflected in Johannesburg. South Africa continues to have the greatest economic inequality in the world, according to a May 2018 statement from the World Bank. Black people experience the most poverty. Most of the elite or top 5% of the population are white. This explains the persistence of segregation in space. Mandela and his new team made a commitment to give the previously underprivileged access to housing, water, electricity, and other amenities after apartheid was overthrown. They weren't planning on the cities receiving such a significant influx of new residents. In towns and cities all over the country, shacks have been erected by millions of people since 1994. In response, formal, albeit small homes have been hurriedly constructed in these unplanned new outlying areas, some of which are located on perilous river banks. Massive amounts of brand new, affordable housing are built outside of cities as a result, and there is little to no intentional urban planning that results in integrated housing solutions. The wealthy remain in their affluent neighborhoods, while the poor mingle with other outlying poor people. We've come to the end of the video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, make sure to drop them in the comments section below, and also like and subscribe for more videos like this.